Every mother's worst nightmare is losing everything: her husband, her protection, her hope for her children's future. Lira lived that nightmare when her mate died in a brutal raid, leaving her pregnant and alone in a world that showed no mercy to the vulnerable. In the harsh village of Varrow, she gave birth to twins just weeks after becoming a widow. The elders called it a curse. Without an alpha's protection, they dragged her to the village square, bound her to a wooden post, and left her and her newborns to die. The whole village watched as she bled under the cold northern sky. King Kael arrived during what should have been her final moments. This battle-hardened alpha ruler had grown tired of political games and empty marriages. When he saw her tied to that post, something inside him shifted. Against every law his kingdom had ever known, he made a choice that would change everything. But what happens when an alpha king risks his entire throne to save a woman his world has condemned to die? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The winter wind howled through the wooden slats of the cabin where Lira had spent the last months of her pregnancy, her swollen belly a constant reminder of both hope and fear. The village of Varrow sat on the edge of the known world, where the civilized territories gave way to wild lands filled with creatures that prowled in the darkness. Here, among the wolf-blooded people, survival depended on strength, hierarchy, and the ancient ways that had kept their kind alive for centuries. Lira pressed her hand against the frost-covered window, watching the men return from their daily hunt. Her mate Gareth should have been among them, should have been the one to burst through their door with snow on his boots and warmth in his eyes, should have been the one to place his hand on her belly and speak softly to the children growing within. But Gareth had been dead for 3 weeks. The raid had come without warning, as they always did. The northern clans had grown bold, striking at the outlying settlements like Varrow with increasing frequency. They took what they could carry and burned what they couldn't. Gareth had died defending the grain stores, his body found beneath the collapsed roof of the storage building, clutching his sword even in death. The other widows in Varrow had at least had time to grieve properly. Their mates had left them with grown children, with established places in the community, with relatives who could speak for them in the council meetings. Lira had none of these things. She had married Gareth only 2 years ago, moving to Varrow from her birth village when it became clear her own community had no place for an Omega without family connections. In the wolf-blooded society, Omegas were protected and cherished, but only when they belonged to someone. An unmated Omega was vulnerable, but a widowed Omega with no family ties was barely more than a burden. And now, carrying twins, she had become something far worse. The midwife, old Sarah, had told her the truth 3 days ago. 2 heartbeats, 2 separate forms moving within her womb. In any other circumstance, twins might have been seen as a blessing, a sign of abundance and strength. But for a widow with no protector, they were a curse that would likely cost her everything. The beliefs ran deep in the northern territories. Twins born to the unmated or unprotected carried darkness with them. They would bring bad fortune to the village, failed harvests, harsh winters, and raiders who could smell the weakness from leagues away. The elders spoke of ancient times when such children had been left on the mountainside for the wolves. And though those days had passed, the fear remained. Lira heard footsteps approaching her door and knew her time had come. She had felt the first pains before dawn, waves of intensity that spoke of imminent birth. There would be no hiding what was coming, no pretending that perhaps the midwife had been wrong. The door opened without ceremony. Old Sarah entered, followed by 3 of the village elders, weathered men whose faces showed no mercy, only grim determination. Behind them came several of the village women, their expressions ranging from pity to barely concealed fear. "It's time," Sarah said simply, setting down her bag of birthing supplies. "The children are coming whether we're ready or not. Elder Thorn, the eldest of the council, stepped forward. His grey beard was braided with small bones, markers of his kills and his wisdom. "We've made our decision, Lira. You'll birth the children, and then we'll see what the gods have sent us." She knew what that meant. They would wait to see if the twins were marked, if they carried obvious signs of their cursed nature. If they appeared normal, perhaps she would be allowed to take them and leave Varrow, to seek shelter in another settlement willing to risk harboring them. If they were marked, if they bore the signs the old stories spoke of, then the ancient laws would take precedence. The labor took most of the day. As the sun tracked across the small window, Lira fought through wave after wave of pain, gripping Sarah's hands while the village women whispered prayers to ward off evil influences. She could hear the men gathering outside, their voices low and serious as they discussed what would need to be done. When the first child emerged, a boy with strong lungs and perfect limbs, Lira felt a moment of hope. Perhaps the gods would be merciful. Perhaps her children would be blessed rather than cursed. But then the second child came, a girl with the same dark hair and healthy cry as her brother. Two perfect infants, born to a widow under the light of a waning moon. The room fell silent. Except for the baby's cries, Elder Thorn examined both children carefully, turning them in the lamplight, checking for any physical signs of their dark nature. Finding none, his expression grew even more troubled. Sometimes the curse was subtle. "Twins to a widow," he said finally. "Born 3 weeks after the father's death, with no family to speak for them or protect them." He looked at Lira with something that might have been regret. "The signs are clear." Old Sarah wrapped the babies in rough cloth, her hands gentle despite her stern expression. "They're healthy," she said quietly. "Strong, perhaps nothing," Thorn interrupted. "You know the old ways as well as any of us, Sarah. Twins to the unprotected bring darkness. We've had 3 failed hunts since word of this pregnancy spread. The northern raiders grow bolder. The signs are everywhere." Lira struggled to sit up, her body still weak from the birth. "Please," she whispered, "they're just babies. They've done nothing wrong." "It's not about wrong or right," Thorn said, though his voice carried the weight of a man who took no pleasure in his duty. "It's about survival, the survival of everyone in this village." Outside, snow began to fall again, the first flakes of what would become a heavy storm. The timing felt significant, another sign for those who believed in such things. Lira held her children close, feeling their small bodies warm against her chest, their tiny fingers grasping at her clothing with the instinctive need of all newborns. The council had already made their decision. She could see it in their faces, in the way they avoided meeting her eyes directly. The ancient punishment for bringing cursed children into the world was exposure. The mother and infants would be bound to posts in the village square and left to face the elements. If the gods truly blessed them, they would survive. If not, their deaths would lift the curse from the community. 200 miles to the south, in the great stone keep that served as the seat of royal power, King Kael stood at his chamber window, watching his own storm clouds gather. At 38, he had ruled for 15 years, ever since his father's death in the last great war with the Eastern Kingdoms. Those had been years of careful diplomacy, strategic marriages among the noble houses, and the endless balancing act required to keep the wolf-blooded clans from tearing each other apart. He was tired, bone-deep weary in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion and everything to do with the weight of constant compromise. The royal council wanted him to marry again. His first wife had died in childbirth 7 years ago, taking their unborn child with her, and they had presented him with a parade of suitable candidates from allied kingdoms. Beautiful women, intelligent women who would bring political advantages and strengthen the realm. None of them had stirred anything in him beyond polite interest. Kael's advisors spoke constantly of duty, of the need for heirs, of the stability that came from proper alliances. They weren't wrong, But their words felt empty against the growing hollowness he felt whenever he considered spending the rest of his life in another loveless political arrangement. His first marriage had been such an arrangement, and while he had grown fond of his wife, there had been no passion between them, no deep connection that made the prospect of sharing a lifetime feel like a gift rather than an obligation. Her death had grieved him, but it had also brought a shameful sense of relief that he could never admit to anyone. The storm outside his window reminded him of his father's words, spoken in the last days before the old king's death. "A ruler's first duty is to his people," his father had said, "but a man who loses himself in service to duty becomes no good to anyone. Find something worth fighting for, son. Something that makes the crown feel less like a burden and more like a tool for protecting what matters." Kael had spent 15 years looking for that something, and he was beginning to suspect it didn't exist. Perhaps some men were meant to rule and others were meant to love, and the gods had not seen fit to grant him both abilities. A knock at his chamber door interrupted his brooding. "Enter," he called, turning from the window. His captain of guards, Marcus, stepped inside and bowed briefly. A practical man in his 50s, Marcus had served Kael's father before him and had no patience for excessive ceremony. "Your Majesty, the advance scouts have returned from the Northern Territories. What's their report?" "The raids continue, but they're not random attacks. There's a pattern to them. They're targeting specific villages, specific resources. Someone's coordinating the northern clans, bringing them together in ways we haven't seen before." Kael frowned. The Northern Territories were supposedly under his protection, though in practice they were left largely to govern themselves as long as they paid their taxes and provided men for the royal army when called upon. If someone was organizing them into a unified force, it could mean trouble for the entire kingdom. "I need to see this for myself," he said finally. "Prepare a small company for travel. We'll make an inspection tour of the border settlements." Marcus looked surprised. "Your Majesty, the Council expects you to review the trade agreements tomorrow, and there's the matter of the West March succession. The Council can handle paperwork without me for a few days. If there's a real threat building in the north, I need to understand it before it becomes a crisis we can't control." "Very well. How many men?" "Keep it small. 20 riders, maybe 25. I want to see how these villages really live, not put on a show for a royal procession." Marcus nodded and turned to leave, then paused. "The weather's turning bad, Your Majesty. This storm looks like it'll last for days. Then we leave as soon as it clears. I've spent too long viewing my kingdom from behind stone walls." As Marcus departed to make the arrangements, Kael returned to his window. The storm was intensifying, snow swirling in the courtyard below like the restless thoughts in his mind. Something was stirring in the Northern Territories, and instinct told him it was more significant than simple raiding parties. Perhaps this journey would give him what he'd been searching for, a purpose that went beyond the endless cycle of political maneuvering and royal obligation. Perhaps, in the wild lands where his people faced real dangers, he would remember what it meant to be more than just a man wearing a crown. The storm raged on, and in villages across the Northern Territories, people huddled around their fires and spoke in whispers of the changes coming. Old women read signs in the patterns of snow against their windows, and men sharpened their weapons while casting nervous glances toward the mountains where shadows moved in ways that had nothing to do with wind and weather. In Varrow, Lira held her newborn twins close and watched the storm through her cabin window, knowing that when it passed, her fate would be decided by men who viewed mercy as a luxury their harsh world could not afford. The storm broke 3 days after the twins were born, leaving Varrow blanketed in pristine snow that sparkled under the pale morning sun. Lira had spent those 3 days in a strange suspension of time, caring for her children while the village council deliberated her fate. She nursed them, changed their wrappings, whispered lullabies in the old tongue that her own mother had sung. To her decades ago, she tried not to think about what was coming, Old Sarah had visited each day, ostensibly to check on the mother and baby's health, but really to provide what comfort she could in the time remaining. The midwife had delivered hundreds of children in her 60 years, and she had seen the ancient laws carried out before, though not often in recent memory. "They're strong," Sarah would say each time she examined the twins. "Perfect lungs. Good. In color. Feeding well. The boy will be a warrior if he's given the chance to grow. The girl has the look of wisdom about her. See how she watches everything with those dark eyes?" Lira treasured these small observations, storing them away like precious stones against the poverty of time she had left with her children. She had named them in her heart, Darian for the boy, Lira for the girl, though she had not spoken the names aloud. Naming them would make what was coming even harder to bear. On the morning after the storm cleared, the decision came. Elder Thorn arrived at her door, flanked by 6 village men, their faces set in the careful neutrality that people wore when they had to do something they didn't like but couldn't avoid. Behind them, most of the village had gathered, forming a solemn procession that would escort her to her judgment. "It's time, Lira," Thorn said simply. He held coiled rope in his weathered hands, thick hemp that would hold against any struggle she might offer. She didn't struggle. What would be the point? If she fought them, they would only bind her more tightly, and her children might be hurt in the process. Instead, she rose from her bed with careful dignity, wrapping the twins in the warmest blankets she possessed. May I say goodbye to them properly?" Thorn's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "You'll have time." They walked through the village in silence, their footsteps muffled by the snow. Lira noticed details with the strange clarity that comes in moments of crisis. The way the smoke from the chimneys rose straight up in the still air, the sound of children playing somewhere out of sight, the smell of bread baking in someone's oven. Ordinary life continuing while hers came to an end. The village square was a simple open space, surrounded by the largest buildings. The council hall, the inn, the communal granary. In the center stood 2 wooden posts, old and weathered, that had served this purpose for generations. They had been cleared of snow and fitted with iron rings for securing ropes. Lira was bound to the larger post, the rope wrapped around her waist and shoulders, but leaving her arms free enough to hold her children. It was a small mercy, one that suggested even the elders hoped the gods might show favor and spare them the worst outcome. The twins seemed to sense the tension around them. Darian fussed and squirmed against her chest, while Lira watched the gathered villagers with those dark, serious eyes that had caught Sarah's attention. Elder Thorn stepped forward to speak the ritual words, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "By the ancient laws of our people, we commit these 3 to the judgment of the gods. If they are blessed, they will survive to see another dawn. If they are cursed, their deaths will lift the shadow from our village and restore the balance. That has been broken." Several of the village women were crying openly now. These were not cruel people. They were frightened people doing what they believed necessary for the survival of everyone they loved. Lira understood this, even as she felt her own terror rising like a cold tide in her chest. The men began to file away, their duty done. The women lingered longer, some offering whispered prayers for mercy, others simply bearing witness to what they hoped would be a quick end if the gods willed it. Eventually, even they departed, leaving Lira alone, with her children in the empty square. The sun climbed higher, but its warmth couldn't penetrate the bitter cold that seemed to seep up from the frozen ground. Lira pulled the blankets tighter around the twins and began to sing softly, the same lullabies she had been whispering to them for days. If these were to be their last hours, she would fill them with love and music instead of fear. It was nearly midday when she heard the sound of approaching horses. At first, she thought it might be raiders. The northern clans sometimes struck in the aftermath of storms when villages were focused on digging out and vulnerable to attack. But as the riders drew closer, she could see they flew royal banners, and their formation was too disciplined for raiders. King Kael had left the royal keep 2 days after the storm broke, leading a company of 24 men on what he told his council was a routine inspection of the border territories. In truth, he was running from the suffocating weight of royal expectations and the growing pressure to choose a bride from the latest crop of political candidates. The ride north had been invigorating in ways he hadn't expected. Away from the stone walls and formal protocols of court, he felt more like himself than he had in months. His men were relaxed, talking and joking as they traveled, and the crisp winter air cleared his head of the persistent fog of royal obligations. They had spent the previous night in the village of Millbrook, 20 miles south of Varrow, where the local headman had treated them to a feast of venison and winter ale while regaling them with stories of increased raider activity. The reports were troubling. Coordinated attacks, strategic targeting of resources, and a level of organization that suggested someone with real military experience was directing the northern clans. Now, riding into Varrow on their way to inspect the northernmost settlements, Kael was looking forward to questioning the local council about what they had observed. Border villages like this one often had the best intelligence about raider movements, since they were usually the first targets. But as his company crested the small hill that overlooked Varrow's main square, all thoughts of raider intelligence fled from his mind. A woman was bound to a wooden post in the center of the square, holding what appeared to be small children against her chest. Even from a distance, he could see that she was in distress, and the arrangement looked disturbingly like an execution. "Marcus," he called sharply to his captain, "I see it, Your Majesty. What are your orders?" Kael spurred his horse forward without answering, his men following close behind. As they reached the square, he could see the woman more clearly, young, perhaps in her early 30s, with long, dark hair and exhausted eyes that held no hope. The bundles in her arms were indeed children, infants from the size of them. He dismounted, while his horse was still moving, striding across the snow-covered ground toward the post. Up close, he could see the rope around her waist and shoulders, the way her lips were blue with cold, the protective way she curved her body around the small lives she held. "What is the meaning of this?" His voice carried the authority of 15 years of kingship, pitched to be heard across the square and into the buildings that surrounded it. The woman looked up at him with surprise and something that might have been recognition. Even bound and half-frozen, she had a dignity about her that struck him immediately. Her eyes were the color of storm clouds, and they held depths of pain that spoke of losses he could only imagine. "Are you hurt?" he asked more gently, stepping closer. "Are the children harmed?" Before she could answer, the door of the council hall opened and several men emerged, led by an elderly figure with a braided beard. The village elders, obviously, drawn by the commotion of a royal company arriving unexpectedly. "Your Majesty," the eldest said, approaching with obvious nervousness. "We had no word of your coming. I am Thorn, first elder of Varrow. If we had known—" "Why is this woman bound?" Kael interrupted, his attention still fixed on the prisoner and her children. Thorn's expression grew careful. "She has been judged. According to our ancient laws, Your Majesty, the twins she bears are cursed, born to a widow with no protector. The gods will decide their fate." "The gods?" Kael's voice was dangerously quiet. "Or did you decide to leave a new mother and her infants to freeze to death in your village square?" "It is the old way, Your Majesty, the law of our people for countless generations. When twins are born to the unprotected, they bring darkness, superstition." The word cracked like a whip in the cold air. "Primitive, barbaric superstition, Elder." Thorn's face flushed, but he maintained his position. "With respect, Your Majesty, you have not lived in the border territories. You have not seen what happens when the old laws are ignored. We have already suffered 3 failed hunts and increased raider activity since word of this pregnancy spread. The signs are coincidence, and your raiders are coordinated attacks by organized enemies, not supernatural punishment for the birth of children." Kael turned back to the woman, whose eyes were now fixed on his face with an intensity that made his chest tighten. "What is your name?" "Lira," she said softly. Her voice was hoarse from cold and fear, but it carried a musical quality that caught his attention. "Lira Ashwood, and these are your children?" She nodded, pulling the blankets closer around the small forms. "Born 3 days ago. My mate died in a raid 3 weeks before they came." Kael felt something shift inside him, a recognition that went deeper than simple sympathy for an unjust situation. This woman, holding her children against impossible odds, embodied something he had been searching for without knowing it. A kind of courage that had nothing to do with swords or battlefields and everything to do with protecting what mattered most. "Marcus," he called without taking his eyes off Lira. "Cut her free, Your Majesty," Elder Thorn protested. "The ancient laws are superseded by royal decree." Kael's voice carried absolute authority now. "No subject of mine will be executed for the crime of giving birth to healthy children." Marcus approached with his knife drawn, sawing quickly through the hemp rope. As the bonds fell away, Lira swayed slightly, her legs unsteady after hours of being bound. Without thinking, Kael stepped forward and steadied her with a hand on her arm. The contact sent an unexpected jolt through him. Not just physical awareness, though that was certainly present, but something deeper. Standing this close, he could see the strength that had carried her through unimaginable loss, the fierce protectiveness that made her hold her children close even in the face of death. "You're coming with me," he said quietly, the words surprising him even as he spoke them. Lyra's eyes widened. "Your Majesty, I don't understand." "You can't stay here." He glanced at the assembled elders, whose faces showed varying degrees of shock and disapproval. "They've made their position clear. I'm offering you protection under royal law. But the curse," Thorn began. "There is no curse," Kael said firmly. "There are only frightened people clinging to old fears instead of facing new realities." He looked around the square, noting how many villagers had emerged from their homes to witness this unprecedented scene. "If raiders trouble your village, it's because they're organized and well-informed, not because of supernatural forces. I suggest you focus your energy on improving your defenses rather than punishing innocents." He turned back to Lira, who was staring at him as if he might vanish like a dream. "Can you ride?" "Yes, Your Majesty, but I have nothing, no possessions." "That can be remedied." He gestured to Marcus. "Have one of the men double up. Lady Lira will need a horse and will need supplies for the children." "Your Majesty," Marcus said carefully, "perhaps we should discuss—" "There's nothing to discuss." Kael's tone brooked no argument. "Gather what's needed. We leave within the hour." As his men moved to carry out his orders, Kael found himself studying Lyra's face, trying to understand the mix of emotions he saw there. Gratitude, certainly, but also fear and confusion. She had been prepared to die, and now she was being offered not just life, but protection by the king himself. "Why?" she asked softly, the question barely audible above the wind. It was a fair question, and one he wasn't entirely sure he could answer. Something about her had moved him in ways he couldn't explain. Her courage in the face of death, the way she had held her children close even when hope was gone, the quiet dignity that no amount of fear or suffering had been able to break. "Because it's right," he said finally, "and because no one should have to face such cruelty alone." The words were true as far as they went, but they didn't capture the full truth. That seeing her bound to that post had awakened something in him that he had thought long dead, a sense of purpose that went beyond duty and politics. For the first time in years, he felt like he was doing something that mattered, not just as a king, but as a man. Within the hour, his company was ready to depart. Lira sat carefully on a gentle mare, her children secured in a sling across her chest that one of his men had improvised from spare blankets. She still looked stunned by the rapid change in her circumstances, but some color had returned to her cheeks, and her eyes had lost the hollow look of someone facing certain death. As they rode out of Varrow, Kael found himself glancing back at her repeatedly, making sure she was managing the ride despite her recent ordeal. Each time their eyes met, he felt that same jolt of recognition, as if something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of his own life. Behind them, the village square stood empty except for the wooden posts and the rope that lay scattered. In the snow, abandoned remnants of a judgment that would never be completed. The next morning brought news that changed the tenor of their journey entirely. One of Kael's advance scouts returned before dawn, with word that raiders had struck 2 villages in the past week, both farther south than any previous attacks. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Someone was pushing the northern clans toward more aggressive action, and they were testing the kingdom's defenses systematically. "Your Majesty," Marcus said as they prepared to break camp, "we should consider turning back. If the raids are moving south, the capital might be under threat." Kael studied the rough map his scout had marked with the attack locations. The pattern showed a level of coordination that troubled him deeply. "No, we continue to the capital as planned, but we send riders ahead to alert the garrison. And we take a more direct route, no more detours for supplies." He glanced at Lira, who was listening to the discussion while nursing one of the twins. The change in plans would mean harder riding, fewer rest stops, and more discomfort for someone still recovering from childbirth. "I can manage it," she said quietly, answering his unspoken concern. "Don't change your plans for me." But as they rode that day, Kael found himself calling for rest stops anyway, watching for signs that the pace was too much for her. Each time, she assured him she was fine, and each time he noticed new details about her, the way she never complained. Despite obvious discomfort, the instinctive way she protected her children during the jolting of faster travel, the quiet competence with which she managed tasks that would have overwhelmed most people in her situation. By afternoon, they could see the towers of the royal keep rising in the distance, dark stone spires that had stood for 300 years. Kael felt the familiar mix of relief and burden that always came with returning home. Relief at the comfort and security the keep provided, burden at the weight of responsibilities that would settle back onto his shoulders the moment he passed through the gates. "It's magnificent," Lira said softly, and he realized she was seeing it for the first time. To someone who had lived her entire life in small frontier villages, the keep must seem impossibly vast and grand. "It's home," he said simply. "Or it will be for you now, if you choose to make it so." They reached the gates as the sun was setting, painting the stone walls golden in the last light. The guards snapped to attention as they recognized their king, but Kael could see the curious glances directed toward Lira and the obvious questions in their eyes. By morning, the entire keep would know that King Kael had returned from his inspection. Tour with a mysterious woman and her children. The thought should have troubled him more than it did. Instead, as he helped Lira dismount and watched her take her first tentative steps into the courtyard of what would be her new home, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: anticipation for what tomorrow might bring. Journey to the royal keep took 5 days, made longer by the need to stop frequently for Lira to tend to her children and recover from her ordeal. Kael found himself adjusting the pace without conscious thought, watching for signs of exhaustion in her face, and calling for rest whenever he saw her shoulders begin to sag. His men noticed, of course. Marcus had served long enough to recognize when his king's attention had been captured by something unusual, and the sideways glances between the guards spoke of conversations that would happen around campfires when they thought themselves unobserved. But none of them questioned the decision directly. Kael's authority was absolute, and his judgment had proven sound too many times for them to doubt it now. On the second day, as they rode through a pine forest heavy with snow, Lira finally spoke. More than the few words necessary for basic communication. Your Majesty, she said during a rest stop, her voice still carrying that musical quality despite her exhaustion. I don't understand why you've done this. The elders weren't wrong about the old laws. They've been followed for generations. Kings before you have honored them. Kael was checking the girth on his horse's saddle, but her words made him pause. Kings before me made many decisions I wouldn't make. The question isn't what's been done before, but what's right now. But the risk to your authority, contradicting village law in front of witnesses. My authority comes from the consent of my people, earned through just rule. If I can't use that authority to protect the innocent, what good is it? She was quiet for a moment, adjusting the blankets around her children. The babies had been remarkably calm during the journey, sleeping for long stretches and feeding without fuss when they needed to. Kael had found himself listening for their small sounds, feeling an unexpected relief each time they stirred and proved they were thriving. The twins, Lira said finally, in the capital, will they be safe? The beliefs about cursed children, do they extend to the royal court? It was a practical question, and one that showed her mind was beginning to work beyond simple survival. The capital has its share of superstitions, Kael admitted, but the royal decree that protected you extends to them as well. Anyone who threatens children under my protection will answer to me personally. The fierceness in his voice surprised them both. Lira looked at him with those storm-grey eyes, and he saw something shift in her expression, the first glimpse of trust beginning to replace the wary gratitude she had shown since Varrow. Thank you, she said quietly. I know you didn't have to do any of this. Yes, I did. The words came out more emphatically than he had intended. Not because of law or duty, but because he stopped, realizing he was about to say something that might reveal more than was wise. Because leaving you there would have made me complicit in something I couldn't live with. That evening, they made camp in a sheltered valley beside a stream that ran clear despite the winter cold. Kael's men were efficient at making camp, and soon they had a fire blazing and hot food cooking. One of the younger guards, Thomas, had produced a piece of soft leather that he spent the evening fashioning into a more comfortable carrier for the twins. I've got 3 little ones at home, Thomas explained to Lira as he worked. This'll distribute the weight better, save your back during the riding. Lira accepted the gift with genuine warmth, the first smile Kael had seen from her since Varrow. It transformed her face completely, showing him glimpses of who she had been before grief and fear had marked her so deeply. As the fire burned down and his men settled into their bedrolls, Kael found himself sitting across from Lira, ostensibly, checking maps for the next day's route, but really just watching her tend to her children. She moved with an economy of motion that spoke of exhaustion held in check by necessity, but there was something graceful about it, a natural rhythm that suggested she had been born to be a mother. What was he like? Kael asked quietly. Your mate. Lira's hands stilled for a moment on the baby she was changing. Gareth was a good man, steady, reliable. He made me laugh. She glanced up at him. He would have loved them. He used to talk to them when they were still in my womb, telling them stories about the hunts he would teach them when they were old enough. How long were you married? 2 years. Not long enough. She wrapped the baby, the girl, he thought, in a clean cloth, and lifted her to her shoulder. We were still learning each other, still finding our way together. I keep thinking about all the conversations we'll never have, all the moments he'll miss. There was no self-pity in her voice, just a quiet sadness that spoke of love lost too soon. Kael found himself envying a dead man he had never met, wondering what it would feel like to be mourned with such genuine affection. My wife died 7 years ago, he said, surprising himself by sharing something so personal. Childbirth. I grieved for the life we might have had, but I realized later that I was grieving more for the idea of love than for love itself. Lira looked at him directly, her expression thoughtful. That's honest. Most people wouldn't admit such a thing. Most people don't have their personal lives scrutinized by entire kingdoms. He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks dancing into the dark sky. The council is eager for me to marry again. They've paraded every eligible daughter of every important family past me for months. Beautiful women, accomplished women. But no connection. No connection, he agreed. They all want to be queen, but none of them seem particularly interested in knowing the man who comes with the crown. Perhaps they're afraid, Lira suggested. Kings are supposed to be larger than life, aren't they? Admitting you're human might be harder for them than you think. It was an insight he hadn't considered, and it made him study her face in the firelight. Here was a woman who had lost everything, who had no reason to care about his personal struggles, offering him perspective that none of his advisors had managed to provide. "What will happen when we reach the capital?" she asked. "I mean, practically speaking. I have no skills that would be useful in a royal court, no family connections, no way to support myself and the children." "You'll be provided for," Kael said. "Immediately. Quarters in the keep, everything you need for yourself and the twins. Your Majesty, I need to contribute something. I need to earn my place." The pride in her voice struck him forcefully. Even after everything she had endured, she wasn't asking for charity. She was asking for the opportunity to prove her worth. "What did you do in your birth village? Before you married?" "I helped the healer. My mother taught me about herbs and medicines before she died. In Varrow, I assisted with difficult births, tended the sick when the regular healer was unavailable." She paused. "It's not much, but it's something." "The royal keep has an infirmary," Kael said thoughtfully. "The chief physician is getting on in years, and he's mentioned needing help with the daily work. If you're interested—" "Yes." The word came out quickly before he had even finished the sentence. "Yes, I would like that very much." Then it settled. He stood, suddenly aware that they had been talking alone by the fire for quite some time, and that his men might draw conclusions from the extended conversation. "We should rest. Tomorrow's ride will be long." But as he walked toward his own bedroll, he found himself reluctant to end the conversation. For the first time in months, he had talked to someone who listened not because they had to, but because they seemed genuinely interested in what he had to say. The feeling was more intoxicating than he cared to admit. The next morning brought news that changed the tenor of their journey entirely. One of Kael's advance scouts returned before dawn with word that raiders had struck 2 villages in the past week, both farther south than any previous attacks. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Someone was pushing the northern clans toward more aggressive action, and they were testing the kingdom's defenses systematically. "Your Majesty," Marcus said as they prepared to break camp, "we should consider turning back. If the raids are moving south, the capital might be under threat." Kael studied the rough map his scout had marked with the attack locations. The pattern showed a level of coordination that troubled him deeply. "No, we continue to the capital as planned, but we send riders ahead to alert the garrison. And we take a more direct route, no more detours for supplies." He glanced at Lira, who was listening to the discussion while nursing one of the twins. The change in plans would mean harder riding, fewer rest stops, and more discomfort for someone still recovering from childbirth. "I can manage it," she said quietly, answering his unspoken concern. "Don't change your plans for me." But as they rode that day, Kael found himself calling for rest stops anyway, watching for signs that the pace was too much for her. Each time she assured him she was fine, and each time he noticed new details about her, the way she never complained despite obvious discomfort, the instinctive way she protected her children during the jolting of faster travel, the quiet competence with which she managed tasks that would have overwhelmed most people in her situation. By afternoon, they could see the towers of the Royal keep rising in the distance, dark stone spires that had stood for 300 years. Kael felt the familiar mix of relief and burden that always came with returning home. Relief at the comfort and security the keep provided, burden at the weight of responsibilities that would settle back onto his shoulders the moment he passed through the gates. "It's magnificent," Lira said softly, and he realized she was seeing it for the first time. To someone who had lived her entire life in small frontier villages, the keep must seem impossibly vast and grand. "It's home," he said simply, "or it will be for you now, if you choose to make it so." They reached the gates as the sun was setting, painting the stone walls golden in the last light. The guards snapped to attention as they recognized their king, but Kael could see the curious glances directed toward Lira and the obvious questions in their eyes. By morning, the entire keep would know that King Kael had returned from his inspection. Tour with a mysterious woman and her children. The thought should have troubled him more than it did. Instead, as he helped Lira dismount and watched her take her first tentative steps into the courtyard of what would be her new home, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: anticipation for what tomorrow might bring. The royal keep bustled with activity even in the evening hours, servants moving through corridors lit by oil lamps, guards changing shifts with practiced efficiency. Lira followed Kael through passages that seemed to stretch endlessly, her arms aching from holding the twins during the long day's ride. "The guest quarters are this way," Kael said, leading her up a wide staircase carved from the same dark stone as the keep's walls. "You'll have privacy there, and the rooms connect to the infirmary wing, so you can begin working when you're ready." They passed tapestries that depicted great battles and hunting scenes, their colors rich even in the lamplight. Lira had never seen such luxury, but she found herself more fascinated by the efficiency of the keep's operation than by its grandeur. Every person they encountered had a purpose, a task that contributed to the greater whole. The guest quarters were more spacious than her entire cabin in Varrow had been. A large bed dominated one room, with a sitting area near a fireplace that had already been lit by unseen servants. Through an open doorway, she could see a smaller chamber with a cradle that someone had hastily brought in. The nursery was prepared. For my first wife's child," Kael said quietly. "It seemed appropriate to make use of it again." Lira set the twins down carefully on the bed, watching them stretch and yawn after being confined in their carrier for so long. "Your Majesty, this is too much. You need rest, and your children need warmth and safety." "That's not too much." He moved to the window, looking out over the courtyard below. "A servant will bring food and anything else you require. Tomorrow I'll introduce you to Master Aldrich, the chief physician, and the council. Won't they object to my presence here?" Kael's jaw tightened slightly. "The council serves at my pleasure, not the other way around. They'll accept my decisions or find themselves seeking new positions." The steel in his voice reminded her forcefully that this man was indeed a king, despite the considerate way he had treated her during their journey. She had seen glimpses of his authority during the confrontation in Varrow, but here in his own stronghold, the full weight of his power was unmistakable. "I should leave you to rest," he said, turning back toward the door, but he paused at the threshold, his hand on the frame. "Lira, if anyone questions your right to be here, or says anything about the twins being cursed, you tell me immediately. Do you understand?" "Yes, Your Majesty." After he left, Lira sank into the chair by the fire, suddenly overwhelmed by the day's events. 3 days ago, she had been prepared to die in a village square. Now she sat in rooms that were finer than anything she had ever imagined, under the protection of a king who had defied ancient traditions to save her life. The twins began to fuss, hungry and uncomfortable in their unfamiliar surroundings. As she nursed them by the firelight, Lira allowed herself to think about the future for the first time since Gareth's death. Working in the infirmary would give her purpose, a way to contribute to this new life she had been given. The children would grow up safe, protected by royal decree from the superstitions that had nearly killed them. But beneath her gratitude lay a growing awareness of something more complicated. The way Kael had looked at her during their conversations, the careful attention he paid to her comfort, the fierceness in his voice when he spoke of protecting her children, these weren't the actions of a king fulfilling an obligation. They suggested something deeper, more personal, and if she was honest with herself, she felt the pull of it too. Despite her grief for Gareth, despite the impossibility of her situation, she found herself thinking about Kael's rare smiles, the moments when his royal facade slipped and she glimpsed the man underneath the crown. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. A servant entered, carrying a tray of food that smelled better than anything she had eaten in months. Roasted meat, fresh bread, vegetables that must have come from the keep's winter stores. Behind the servant came an older woman with greying hair and kind eyes. "I'm Mara," the woman said with a slight curtsy. "The king has asked me to see to your needs while you settle in. If there's anything you require, baby linens, different food, warmer clothing, you need only ask." "Thank you," Lira said, touched by the genuine warmth in the woman's voice. "Everyone has been so kind." His Majesty spoke to the senior staff. "Before retiring," Mara said, arranging the food on a small table, "he made it clear that you and the children are honored guests, to be treated with the same respect as any visiting nobility." After Mara left, Lira ate slowly, savoring flavors she had almost forgotten existed. Through the window, she could see lights in the keep's towers, evidence of the many lives that intersected within these walls. Somewhere among those lights was Kael, perhaps dealing with the reports of increased raider activity, perhaps thinking about the decisions he had made that day. The next morning brought her first real test of acceptance in her new home. Kael arrived at her quarters shortly after dawn, accompanied by a tall, elderly man with sharp eyes and silver hair. "Master Aldrich," Kael said by way of introduction, "this is Lady Lira Ashwood. I've told her about the position in the infirmary." Aldrich studied her with the assessing gaze of someone accustomed to judging people quickly and accurately. "The king tells me you have experience with healing. What sort of training?" "My mother was a village healer," Lira replied, holding one of the twins while the other slept peacefully in the cradle. "She taught me about medicinal herbs, how to treat common illnesses and injuries. I assisted with births, tended fever cases, helped set broken bones. Practical experience then, rather than formal study." "Yes, sir. I know my limitations, but I'm willing to learn." Aldrich's expression softened slightly. "Practical experience is often more valuable than books. Can you start this afternoon? We have several patients recovering from injuries sustained during the recent raids, and I could use competent help." "I would be honored to help." After Aldrich left, Kael lingered in her sitting room, watching her settle the twins for their morning rest. "You impressed him," he said. "Aldrich doesn't offer positions lightly. I hope I can live up to his expectations." "You will." His confidence in her was both reassuring and slightly overwhelming. "There's something else we should discuss. The council will want to meet you, formally acknowledge your presence here. They'll have questions." "What sort of questions?" "About your background, your intentions, your long-term plans." He paused. "About your relationship to me." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither was quite ready to address directly. Lira felt heat rise in her cheeks as she realized that others had already begun to speculate about the nature of her rescue and the king's continued attention to her welfare. "What should I tell them?" "The truth, that you're under royal protection after suffering an injustice, that you're here to work in the infirmary and raise your children in safety." His eyes met hers directly. "Anything beyond that is no one's business but ours." The word ours sent an unexpected thrill through her, even as she tried to suppress it. She was a widow still grieving her mate, a woman whose children had nearly been killed for the circumstances of their birth. Whatever she might feel toward the man who had saved them, acting on those feelings would be complicated beyond measure. But as Kael took his leave, promising to check on her progress in the infirmary later, Lira found herself watching him go. with an intensity that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with the growing awareness that her heart was not as guarded as she had believed. That afternoon, she made her way to the infirmary with a mixture of nervousness and anticipation. The work would be familiar, a return to skills that had given her purpose before marriage and motherhood. But it would also be her first real interaction with the keep's residents, as someone other than a curiosity to be stared at. Master Aldrich introduced her to the other healers and assistants with brisk efficiency, explaining her background and making it clear that she was to be treated as a valued colleague. The patients proved to be a mix of guards injured during training, servants who had suffered accidents, and 3 men who bore the wounds of the recent raider attacks. Working with her hands again, treating injuries and offering comfort to those in pain, Lira felt pieces of herself beginning to reconnect. This was who she had been before grief and fear had consumed her, a healer, someone who eased suffering and restored health. The familiar rhythms of mixing medicines and changing bandages grounded her in ways that royal quarters and fine food could not. As the afternoon wore on, she became aware that she was being watched. Not with hostility, but with curiosity and something that might have been approval. Word of her rescue had spread through the keep, and the staff seemed genuinely interested in the woman their king had chosen to protect. "You have gentle hands," said Willem, one of the injured guards, as she cleaned and rebandaged a sword cut on his arm. "Haven't felt this comfortable during treatment in years." "Master Aldrich's assistants are all skilled," Lira replied, diplomatically. "Aye, but there's something different about you. A calmness, maybe. Makes a man feel like he'll truly heal instead of just survive." As she finished her work and prepared to return to her quarters, Lira reflected on Willem's words. Perhaps this was what she could contribute here. Not just competent medical care, but the kind of compassionate attention that helped people heal in spirit as well as body. That evening, Kael appeared at her door again, this time carrying a bottle of wine and wearing the slightly tired expression of someone who had spent hours dealing with administrative details. "How was your first day?" he asked, settling into the chair across from her usual spot by the fire. "Rewarding." Master Aldrich was right about the patients from the raider attacks. They needed both medical attention and someone to listen to their fears about the increasing violence. "And how are you holding up? It's been a significant adjustment coming." "Here." Lira considered the question carefully. "I feel useful again," she said finally. "For the first time since Gareth died, I feel like I have a purpose beyond just surviving." Kael poured wine for both of them. The domestic gesture somehow more intimate than grander royal ceremonies would have been. "I'm glad. I worried that the transition might be too overwhelming." "It is overwhelming," she admitted, "but in a way that feels like growth rather than burden." She paused, studying his face in the firelight. "What about you? How has your council received the news of your new guest?" His smile was rueful, about as well as you'd expect. "3 of them have already suggested suitable marriages that would distract me from inappropriate attachments. 2 others have questioned the wisdom of defying village law so publicly." "And what did you tell them? That my personal life is not subject to committee review?" He took a sip of wine, his expression growing more serious. "But I won't lie to you, Lira. There will be pressure. The kingdom needs political alliances, and my unmarried status has become a diplomatic issue. Eventually, those pressures may become impossible to ignore." His honesty was both painful and appreciated. He was warning her gently that whatever was growing between them existed within constraints that neither of them could change. A king's choices were never purely personal, and she would be naive to forget that. "I understand," she said quietly. "I'm grateful for the protection you've given me and the children. I don't assume anything beyond that." But even as she spoke the words, she knew they weren't entirely true. She did expect something beyond mere protection, found herself hoping for it despite the impossibility of the situation. And from the way Kael was looking at her, She suspected he felt the same dangerous pull towards something neither of them could name aloud. Not yet. 3 weeks passed in a rhythm that began to feel almost normal. Lira's days were filled with work. In the infirmary, where Master Aldrich had begun entrusting her with increasingly complex cases. Her nights were devoted to her children, who seemed to thrive in the warmth and security of the keep. And her evenings, those had become something she looked forward to with an anticipation that both thrilled and worried her. Kael had developed a habit of visiting her quarters after the evening meal, ostensibly to check on her adjustment to life. In the keep, but really, she suspected, because those quiet conversations by the fire had become as important to him as they were to her. They talked about everything: her work in the infirmary, his struggles with the council, memories of their different childhoods, hopes for the future of the kingdom. It was during one of these evening visits that he brought troubling news. "The raids are getting worse," he said, accepting the cup of tea she offered. The twins were sleeping peacefully in their cradle, and the fire cast dancing shadows on the stone walls. 3 more villages hit this week, and the pattern is definitely moving south toward the capital. Are we in danger here? The keep itself is well defended, but I'm concerned about the coordination behind these attacks. Someone with real military knowledge is directing them. He rubbed his forehead wearily. My scouts report that the northern clans are uniting in ways they never have before. That level of organization suggests outside influence. Lira set down her own tea, studying his face. "What will you do?" "I'll have to ride north again, this time with a proper army. We need to find out who's behind this before they grow strong enough to threaten the entire kingdom." The thought of him leaving, of riding into danger while she remained safe behind stone walls, created an unexpected tightness in her chest. When had his welfare become so important to her? When had the idea of losing him become almost unbearable? How long would you be gone? Weeks, possibly months. It depends on what we find. He looked at her directly, and she saw her own feelings reflected in his eyes. "I wanted you to know before the announcement is made officially." They sat in silence for a moment, both aware that their fragile evening routine was about to be disrupted, possibly permanently. The campaign would take him away just as whatever was growing between them had begun to feel real and precious. "There's something else," Kael said finally. "The council has been pushing harder for me to marry before I leave. They're worried about succession, about what happens if I don't return from this campaign." Lira's heart sank, though she tried not to let it show on her face. Are you considering their advice?" "I've agreed to meet with the candidates. They've selected," his voice was carefully neutral, 3 daughters of allied kingdoms, all politically advantageous matches. "Of course." She kept her own voice steady with effort. "That makes sense, does it?" The intensity in his voice made her look up sharply. "Does it make sense to marry someone I don't love, someone who doesn't know me, just to satisfy political requirements?" "You're a king," she said softly. "Your choices have consequences beyond your own happiness. And what about your happiness? What about what you want?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications that neither had dared to voice before. Lira felt as if she stood at the edge of a precipice, one step away from changing everything. "What I want doesn't matter," she said finally. "I'm a widow with no family, no political value. Even if there were feelings involved, there's no future in it." There could be. The words were so quiet she almost missed them. When she looked at him, she saw something in his expression that made her breath catch, hope and longing, and a determination that spoke of decisions already half made. "Kael," she whispered, using his name without title for the first time. Don't say things that can't be true. Can't they be?" He leaned forward close enough that she could see the firelight reflected in his eyes. "I'm the king. I make the laws. If I choose to marry for love instead of politics, your kingdom would suffer. Your allies would be offended. Your own nobles might rebel." She wanted to reach out to him, to touch his face and tell him that She felt the same impossible hope, but she forced herself to remain still. "You know this. You're not thinking clearly. I've never thought more clearly in my life." His voice carried absolute conviction. "These past weeks, talking with you, watching you build a life here, I've remembered what it feels like to want something for myself rather than for the crown." Before she could respond, a soft knock interrupted them. Mara entered with her usual discretion, but her expression was unusually urgent. "Your Majesty, forgive the intrusion, but Lord Regent Aldred has requested your immediate presence in the council chamber. He says it's urgent." Kael rose reluctantly, the moment broken. "I'll come now." He looked back at Lira, and she saw reluctance and frustration in his face. "We'll continue this conversation." After he left, Lira sat by the dying fire, her mind churning with everything he had said and implied. The smart thing would be to discourage whatever feelings were developing between them, to remind him of his duties and encourage him to make the politically sensible choice. But her heart had other ideas. For the first time since Gareth's death, she felt truly alive, truly connected to another person. The thought of watching Kael marry someone else, of pretending that their evening conversations meant nothing more than kindness to a refugee, was almost unbearable. The next morning brought news that explained the council's urgency. A messenger had arrived from the Northern Territories with word that the raider attacks had suddenly stopped, not because the threat had diminished, but because the various clans appeared to be gathering in a central location, massing forces for something much larger than random raids. "It's an army," Marcus reported during the emergency council session that Lira learned about secondhand from gossip in the infirmary. "Estimated at least 5,000 strong, possibly more. They're building fortifications, establishing supply lines. This isn't raiding anymore. It's preparation for war." The news changed everything. Kael's departure was moved up. The campaign would be larger and more dangerous than anyone had anticipated, and the pressure for him to secure his succession became overwhelming. That afternoon, as Lira was cleaning instruments in the infirmary, Master Aldrich approached her with an expression that suggested important news. "The king has requested that you join the medical corps for the northern campaign," he said without preamble. Lira nearly dropped the bottle she was holding. "I'm sorry, what?" "He's specifically asked for you to serve as one of the field medics. He says your experience with battlefield injuries makes you valuable for this type of operation." She had never mentioned battlefield injuries to Kael. Her work in Varrow had included treating men wounded in skirmishes with raiders. But she had never spoken of the darker skills she had learned, how to work quickly under pressure, how to decide who could be saved and who was beyond help, how to keep functioning when surrounded by pain and death. "Did he say why he wants me specifically?" Eldrick's expression suggested he understood more than he was saying. "He said he trusts your competence and judgment under pressure. He also mentioned that the twins could travel with the medical wagons. It's not uncommon for camp followers to bring children on long campaigns. The offer was both an honor and a trap. It would mean staying close to Kael, continuing their conversations and the growing connection between them. But it would also mean traveling with an army, exposing her children to the dangers of a military campaign, and being present when he met with his potential brides. "I need time to consider this," she said finally. "Of course, he'll want an answer by tomorrow. The army departs in 3 days." That evening, Kael arrived at her quarters earlier than usual, his expression troubled. The twins were awake and alert, and he surprised her by sitting on the floor beside their cradle, letting them grasp his fingers with their tiny hands. "They're growing strong," he said, watching Darian's determined attempts to hold onto his thumb. "Children are resilient. They adapt to new circumstances better than adults do." She sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "Master Aldrich told me about your offer. I know it's a risk, bringing them on campaign, but the medical corps travels with heavy protection, and he paused, looking at her directly. "I don't want to leave you behind. Because you need competent medics, because I need you." The admission seemed to surprise him as much as it did her. "These past weeks, you matter to me, Lira. More than is wise, more than is sensible, but I can't change how I feel. And the marriage meetings, the political brides," his jaw tightened. "I've agreed to meet them, but I haven't agreed to marry anyone. The council can present their candidates, but the final choice is mine. Kael." She reached out without thinking, covering his hand with hers. "You're putting me in an impossible position. If I come with you, if I'm there while you're meeting women you might marry, if you're there, I'll remember what I actually want instead of what I'm supposed to want." He turned his hand palm up, intertwining their fingers. "I'm not asking you to make any promises or decisions. I'm just asking you not to disappear from my life when I need you most." Looking down at their joined hands, at her children who were beginning to smile, at the man who had saved their lives, Lira felt the last of her resistance crumble. It was selfish, possibly foolish, and definitely dangerous to everyone involved. But she couldn't bring herself to refuse. "I'll come," she said quietly, "but you have to understand, I won't be the other woman, Kael. I won't lurk in the background while you court someone else. If you decide to marry for politics, I'll accept it, but I won't pretend it doesn't hurt. You won't have to pretend anything." He lifted their joined hands and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles, a gesture so tender it made her heart ache. "I promise you that." 3 days later, as the army prepared to march north toward an uncertain confrontation, Lira settled her children in the medical wagon and tried not to think about all the ways this decision could end in heartbreak. But as she watched Kael review final preparations, his presence both commanding and reassuring, she knew she had made the only choice her heart would allow. The royal army moved north like a great serpent. 3,000 soldiers accompanied by supply wagons, siege equipment, and the medical corps that had become Lira's new home. The pace was steady but not punishing, designed to conserve strength for the battles ahead while covering ground efficiently. Lira had found her place among the other field medics, most of them experienced veterans who accepted her competence without question once they saw her work. The twins traveled remarkably well, seeming to enjoy the constant motion and new sights, though Lira remained constantly vigilant about their safety and health. On the 3rd day of the march, she discovered something that changed her understanding of her children completely. She had been treating a soldier's infected wound when little Lira, who had been lying quietly in her traveling basket, suddenly began crying with unusual intensity. At first, Lira assumed the baby was hungry or uncomfortable, but when she picked her daughter up, the crying stopped immediately. And the soldier's wound, which had been showing signs of dangerous infection, appeared noticeably less inflamed. It could have been coincidence. Infections sometimes improved suddenly, especially with proper treatment. But something about the timing, combined with the strange intensity of Lyra's crying, made Lira pay closer attention to her children's behavior around the sick and wounded. Over the following days, she noticed a pattern. Both twins seemed unusually sensitive to suffering around them, becoming restless when near seriously injured soldiers and calming when those same soldiers began to recover. When she held them while working, her patients consistently reported feeling better, healing faster, experiencing less pain. The implications were troubling. If her children possessed some kind of healing ability, it would explain why the elders in Varrow had been so frightened of them. Twins with supernatural gifts would indeed seem cursed to people who feared anything beyond their understanding, but it would also make them incredibly valuable and incredibly dangerous to have around. Healing abilities were the stuff of legends, associated with ancient bloodlines that most people believed had died out centuries ago. She mentioned her observations to no one, not even Kael, during their evening conversations. The army was full of superstitious men who might react poorly to the suggestion that her children possessed mystical powers. Better to keep watching, learning, and protecting them from scrutiny until she understood more. It was on the 5th day of the march that Kael's political obligations caught up with them. The first bride candidate arrived with her own retinue, Lady Celeste of Westmarch, daughter of a duke whose alliance Kael's kingdom badly needed. She was everything the council could have hoped for: beautiful, accomplished, educated in statecraft, and accompanied by promises of trade agreements and military support. Lira watched from a distance as Lady Celeste was welcomed into the command tent, noting the woman's poise and obvious breeding. This was what a queen should look like: elegant, confident, born to the role she would assume. That evening, Kael arrived at the medical wagons later than usual, his expression unreadable. "How did the meeting go?" Lira asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. She's intelligent and well-informed about the political situation. She would make a competent queen. He sat heavily on the supply crate that had become his usual seat during these visits. "She's also completely uninterested in me as a person. That's not necessarily a disadvantage in a political marriage, isn't it?" His voice carried a weariness that had nothing to do with the day's march. "She spent an hour discussing trade policies and succession laws. She asked about my military strategy and my position on taxation. She never once asked about my interests, my concerns, what I hope for beyond political necessity." Lira felt a guilty flutter of relief, followed immediately by shame at her own selfishness. Perhaps she was nervous. First meetings are always difficult. Perhaps. He was quiet for a moment, watching the twins sleep in their basket. She made one comment that stuck with me. When I mentioned my commitment to protecting the vulnerable members of society, she said that charity was admirable, but that a king's primary concern should be strength and stability. She's not wrong from a practical standpoint. No, but her dismissal of charity as secondary to strength made me think about what kind of kingdom we'd build together. One where the strong prosper and the weak are forgotten, where tradition matters more than justice. The criticism was clearly meant to contrast with Lira's own situation, rescued from unjust treatment, given protection despite political inconvenience. She wondered if Lady Celeste would have supported the decision to save her, or if she would have counseled following village law to avoid diplomatic complications. "Have you decided whether to pursue the match?" "I've agreed to continue the meetings. The council has arranged for all 3 candidates to travel with us, ostensibly to demonstrate their commitment to supporting military endeavors." His smile was sardonic. In reality, it's an extended courtship under the most public circumstances possible. Over the following week, as the army continued north toward the gathering enemy forces, Lira watched Kael navigate the delicate politics of royal courtship. Lady Celeste was joined by Lady Marion of Easthold, a sharp-witted woman with extensive experience in court intrigue, and Lady Valeria of Northpoint, whose family controlled crucial mountain passes and trade routes. All 3 were impressive in different ways. Lady Marion could discuss military strategy as competently as any general, while Lady Valeria demonstrated remarkable skill in logistics and resource management. They were accomplished women who would bring valuable assets to any marriage alliance. They were also clearly competing with each other, though with the refined subtlety expected of noble ladies. Each sought opportunities to demonstrate her superior qualifications while subtly undermining her rivals' positions. Lira found herself in the uncomfortable position of observing this competition while trying to focus on her medical duties. The medics, unaware of her personal involvement in the situation, often speculated about which candidate the king might choose and what the political implications of each potential match would be. "Lady Celeste has the strongest family connections," observed Master Jorik, the senior field medic, during one of their evening discussions. "But Lady Marion's military background could be valuable given the current threats to the kingdom." "What about Lady Valeria?" asked Helena, one of the younger medics. "Her family controls those northern trade routes we'll need if this conflict drags on." "All practical considerations," Lira said carefully. "But what about personal compatibility? Surely that matters for a marriage that will last decades. Master Jorik shrugged. Royal marriages aren't about personal feelings. They're about creating stability and strengthening the realm. The king understands his duties. The conversation left Lira feeling hollow. Everyone seemed to assume that Kael would make the sensible political choice, that personal feelings were irrelevant to royal decision-making. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps her growing hopes were built on naive misunderstanding of how kingdoms actually functioned. But that night, when Kael visited the medical camp, his first question was about her children, rather than military reports or political strategy. "How are they adjusting to life on the march?" he asked, settling beside her as the twins nursed quietly. "Better than I expected. They seem to enjoy the constant stimulation." She hesitated, then decided to share her observations. "I've noticed something interesting about their behavior around injured soldiers." She described the pattern she had seen, the apparent correlation between her children's presence and improved healing outcomes. Kael listened with growing intensity, asking careful questions about specific incidents and timing. "You think they have some kind of healing ability?" "I think it's possible. It would explain why the elders were so frightened of them. If they possess abilities associated with ancient bloodlines, it would seem like dangerous magic to people who don't understand it." Kael studied the sleeping twins with new attention. "There are legends about healing bloodlines, families who could channel life force to mend injuries and cure diseases. Most scholars consider them myths. What if they're not myths? What if that's why my children survived when they should have died in Varrow Square? Then they're even more precious than I realized." His voice carried a protectiveness that made her heart skip, and potentially more dangerous to have around an army full of superstitious soldiers. "I've been careful. I don't think anyone else has noticed the pattern yet. We'll keep it that way." He reached out and gently touched Darian's tiny hand. "Whatever abilities they might have, they're just children. They deserve to grow up without being feared or exploited." The conversation was interrupted by the approach of a messenger, who bowed hastily before delivering his report. "Your Majesty, Lady Marion requests your presence at the command tent. She says she has information about the enemy forces that requires immediate attention." Kael sighed and rose to leave. "I'll return later if I can." But he didn't return that night or the next. The demands of managing both a military campaign and royal courtship left him little time for personal conversations. And when Lira did see him, it was usually from a distance, as he consulted with his officers or met with the marriage candidates. She tried to focus on her work, treating the various injuries and ailments that plagued any army on the march. The twins continued to thrive, their apparent abilities remaining unnoticed by anyone except her. But the growing distance from Kael, combined with watching him spend increasing amounts of time with women who could offer him the political partnerships he needed, left her feeling isolated and uncertain. It was Lady Valeria who finally addressed the situation directly. The noblewoman appeared at the medical wagons one evening, accompanied by a single guard and carrying herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting her way. "Lady Lira," she said with a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes, "I was hoping we might have a private conversation." Lira accepted the invitation warily, settling the twins with one of the other medics before walking a short distance from the wagons with her unexpected visitor. "I understand you've become quite close to His Majesty," Lady Valeria said without preamble. "The entire army has noticed his particular attention to your welfare. The king was kind enough to rescue me from an unjust situation. I'm grateful for his protection." "Of course, but gratitude can sometimes be mistaken for deeper feelings, especially in stressful circumstances." Lady Valeria's tone was carefully reasonable. "I wanted to speak with you, woman to woman, to help you understand the reality of your situation." "I'm not sure what you mean." "I mean that whatever feelings may have developed during your time together, they have no future. The king will marry for political reasons. He must, for the good of the kingdom. Any personal attachments he may have formed will become irrelevant once he fulfills his royal duties. The words stung because they echoed Lira's own doubts. Has the king indicated his intentions regarding marriage? Not specifically, but the pressures are becoming impossible to ignore. My family controls trade routes that could be shut down if this conflict drags on. Lady Marion's military connections could provide reinforcements if the enemy proves stronger than expected. Lady Celeste's dowry could fund a longer campaign if necessary. Lady Valeria's voice remained pleasant, but her meaning was clear. You offer none of these advantages. I've never claimed to offer political advantages. Then you understand why continuing to encourage the king's personal interest would be selfish and ultimately harmful to everyone involved. Lady Valeria paused, studying Lyra's face. I'm not saying this to be cruel. I'm saying it because I believe you care about him enough to want what's best for him and his kingdom. After Lady Valeria left, Lira sat alone beside the medical wagons, staring up at stars that seemed impossibly distant. The noblewoman's words had struck at every doubt, and fear she had been trying to suppress. Was she being selfish by allowing her relationship with Kael to continue? Was she putting her own feelings ahead of his responsibilities and the kingdom's needs? The next morning brought news that made such questions seem temporarily irrelevant. Scouts reported that the enemy forces were larger than anticipated, nearly 8,000 strong, and that they had moved south faster than expected. The two armies would meet within days, possibly within hours. As the medical corps prepared for the coming battle, Lira found herself thinking not about politics or marriage, alliances, but about the man who would lead his soldiers into a fight that could claim his life. Whatever happened between them in the future, she couldn't bear the thought of losing him to an enemy blade. That evening, as the army made its final preparations for battle, Kael appeared at the medical camp one last time. He looked exhausted, but determined, carrying the weight of command with the same quiet strength she had first seen in Varrow's village square. "Are you ready for this?" he asked, settling beside her as they watched the twins sleep peacefully despite the tension around them. As ready as anyone can be for their first real battle. She studied his face in the firelight. "Are you? I've been in battles before, but never one with so much at stake." He was quiet for a moment. "If something happens to me tomorrow, don't." She couldn't bear to hear him speak of his own death. "Don't say that. If something happens," he continued gently, "Marcus has orders to escort you and the children back to the capital. You'll be provided for, protected, given whatever you need to build a life." "Kael, let me finish." He turned to face her directly. "I need you to know that these past weeks, getting to know you, watching you build something meaningful here, it's been the best part of my life. Whatever political decisions I have to make, whatever the future holds, that won't change." Before she could respond, he leaned forward and kissed her gently, a gesture that carried all the tenderness and longing they had been holding back. It lasted only a moment, but it felt like a promise and a goodbye all at once. "Stay safe tomorrow," he said softly, then disappeared into the darkness to make his final preparations for a battle that would determine the fate of everyone she had come to care about. The battle began at dawn, with the thunder of 8,000 enemy warriors crashing against Kael's defensive lines. Lira worked frantically in the field hospital as wounded soldiers poured in, her hands steady despite the chaos around her. The sound of clashing metal and dying men filled the air, punctuated by the screams of horses and the shouted orders of officers trying to maintain control. The twins remained remarkably calm, despite the violence nearby, and Lira began to notice something extraordinary. Every soldier she treated while holding one of her children recovered faster, bled less, showed fewer signs of shock. Word began to spread among the wounded that the healer with the babies had special powers, that men who were treated by her survived wounds that should have been fatal. It was Master Jorik who first put the pieces together. "Those children of yours," he said during a brief lull in the fighting, his voice low and urgent. "There's something different about them. I've seen battlefield medicine for 30 years, and I've never seen recovery rates like this." Before Lira could respond, a commotion near the command tent drew their attention. A group of enemy soldiers had broken through the lines, and they were heading directly for the medical camp. Lira grabbed her children and ran toward the supply wagons, but she knew they wouldn't reach safety in time. Then something impossible happened. As the enemy warriors raised their weapons, little Lira began to cry. Not the normal cry of a frightened infant, but something that seemed to resonate in the very air around them. The attacking soldiers stopped as if they had run into an invisible wall, their faces going blank and confused. For a moment that stretched like an eternity, they simply stood there, their weapons lowering as if they had forgotten why they were fighting. That moment was enough for Kael's guards to arrive and cut down the confused enemies, but Lira had seen what happened. Her daughter had done something that went far beyond simple healing. She had somehow affected the minds of armed warriors, stopping them in their tracks with nothing but the power of her voice. The battle continued for hours, with the tide turning, gradually in favor of Kael's forces. But it was what happened after the fighting ended that changed everything Lira thought she knew about her situation. Among the captured enemy leaders was a man who looked familiar, too familiar. When he was brought to the command tent for interrogation, Lira felt a chill of recognition that had nothing to do with the cooling evening air. It was her uncle, Aldwin Ashwood, whom she had believed dead for 15 years. The revelation came during the interrogation that Kael conducted personally, with his senior officers present. Lira watched from outside the tent, her children in her arms, as the truth unfolded in fragments that reconstructed her entire understanding of her own life. Aldwin Ashwood had not died in the plague that supposedly wiped out the Ashwood bloodline. He had orchestrated his own family's destruction to claim their lands and titles, selling out to northern enemies who promised him greater power in exchange for destabilizing the kingdom from within. The Ashwood family had been the last known descendants of the ancient healing bloodlines, possessing abilities that were feared and coveted in equal measure. Aldwin had killed his own relatives to prevent anyone from challenging his claim to power, but he had missed one, his brother's pregnant wife, who had fled to a distant village and hidden her identity to protect her unborn child, Lira's mother, and therefore Lira herself. "The bloodline continues," Aldwin said during his confession, his voice carrying a mixture of triumph and resignation. "I spent years hunting for any survivors, but the girl vanished completely. I assumed the line had truly ended with her mother's death." "What bloodline?" Kael demanded. "What are you talking about?" "The Moonborn," Aldwin replied, using a term that made several of the older officers shift uncomfortably. "Healers who could channel life force, seers who could influence minds, children born under blood moons who carried the power to unite or destroy kingdoms." He smiled coldly. "My niece was born under such a moon. If she lives, if she has children, the bloodline lives on." Kael's face had gone very still. "And the raids? The attacks on border villages?" "Searching, always searching. We knew she had married and moved to the frontier territories. The raids were meant to flush out anyone with healing abilities, anyone who might be harboring descendants of the old bloodlines." "And Gareth's death? A stroke of luck. When we learned his wife was pregnant with twins, we knew we had found our target. Twins born to the Moonborn bloodline, especially after the father's death. Such children would be powerful beyond imagining." Aldwin's expression grew hungry. "We killed him to ensure the children would be born unprotected, vulnerable to capture." The pieces fell into place with horrible clarity. Gareth's death hadn't been random. It had been calculated murder designed to leave Lira defenseless. The village's reaction to her twins hadn't been simple superstition. It had been ancestral, memory of what such children could become. And her own survival, her children's abilities, even their meeting with Kael, none of it had been chance. The blood moon rises again in 2 nights, Aldwin continued, his voice taking on an almost religious fervor. If the children are brought to the ancient sites during that time, their powers will awaken fully. They could heal entire armies or destroy them with a thought. Whoever controls them controls the future of every kingdom on this continent. Kael stepped forward, his hand on his sword hilt. Where are these ancient sites? You think I would tell you? Aldwin laughed bitterly. You think I would hand you the key to absolute power? But one of his captured lieutenants, perhaps hoping for mercy, provided the answer. The standing stones of Vorthak, 2 days' ride north. That's where we were supposed to bring the children once we captured them. After the interrogation ended, Kael found Lira waiting in stunned silence beside the medical wagons. The twins were sleeping peacefully, unaware that their entire future had just been redefined by the revelations of the past few hours. You knew, Kael said quietly, sitting beside her, about their abilities, about what they could become. I suspected something, but I never imagined this. Her voice was barely above a whisper. My mother never told me about the bloodline, about what I was. She said we were fleeing political troubles, that my father had backed the wrong side in some long-forgotten conflict. She was protecting you. If Aldwin had known you survived, he would have killed me years ago. Lira looked down at her sleeping children, seeing them with new eyes. What happens now? If they're truly as powerful as he claims, then they need protection more than ever. Kael's voice carried absolute determination and training, guidance. From people who understand what they're dealing with. Do such people even exist anymore? We'll find them, or we'll learn together. He paused, studying her face in the firelight. There's something else we need to discuss. With your true heritage revealed, your political value has changed dramatically. Lyra's heart sank as she understood his meaning. I'm no longer just a powerless widow. You're the last known heir of one of the most powerful bloodlines in history, mother to children who could reshape the balance of power across multiple kingdoms. His expression was carefully neutral. The council will want to discuss marriage alliances immediately. The irony was bitter. For weeks, she had been told that her lack of political value made any relationship with Kael impossible. Now that value had been restored in the most dramatic way possible. But it would make her a target for every ambitious noble family on the continent. And the blood moon ceremony. What if Aldwin was telling the truth about awakening their powers? Then we face a choice. We can try to suppress their abilities, keep them hidden, and hope they never manifest fully, or we can help them learn to control powers that could either save this kingdom or destroy it. Lira thought about little Lyra's cry that had stopped. Enemy soldiers in their tracks, about the way wounded men healed faster when her children were nearby. The power was already there, growing stronger as they grew older. Suppressing it might be impossible. If we help them awaken their abilities, if we go to these standing stones, we'll be taking an enormous risk. But if we don't, someone else will eventually capture them and use their powers for purposes we can't control. Kael reached out and touched her hand gently. The choice is yours, Lira. They're your children. Looking at her sleeping babies, Lira realized that her simple hope for safety and security had been shattered completely. Her children were not just twins born to an unlucky widow. They were potential wielders of legendary power, heirs to abilities that could change the course of history. And in 2 days, under the light of a blood moon, she would have to decide whether to help them claim that inheritance or spend the rest of their lives running from those who would exploit it. The decision she made would determine not just their future, but the future of everyone in the kingdom who depended on how such power would ultimately be used. The woman who had once faced death in a village square for the crime of giving birth to twins now held the fate of nations in her hands, and the weight of that responsibility was almost unbearable. But as she looked at Kael, seeing the same fierce protectiveness in his eyes that she felt in her own heart, she realized she wouldn't have to carry that burden alone. Whatever came next, whatever dangers or opportunities the blood moon would bring, They would face it together. The revelation had changed everything about her past and her children's future. Now it remained to be seen whether it would change the possibilities for her own heart as well. The standing stones of Vorthak rose from the moorland like ancient sentinels, their weathered surfaces carved with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe in the light of the rising blood moon. Lira stood at the edge of the stone circle, her children in her arms, while Kael's most trusted guards formed a protective perimeter around the sacred site. They had ridden hard for 2 days to reach this place, driven by the knowledge that others would come seeking the same goal. Aldwin's revelation had spread through the enemy forces, and scattered groups of northern raiders were already converging on the location, hoping to claim the twins for their own purposes. "The carvings are active," observed Master Aldrich, who had accompanied them despite his advanced age. "I've read about such things in the oldest texts, but I never believed I would see them myself." Indeed, the stone symbols seemed to pulse with their own inner light, responding to the presence of the blood moon overhead. As Lira walked closer to the central stone, the carvings grew brighter, and she felt something awakening deep in her chest, a warmth that spread through her body like sunlight through water. "You feel it too," said a voice from the shadows beyond the stones. Everyone spun toward the sound, weapons appearing in hands with practiced speed. From behind the largest stone stepped an elderly woman, bent with age but moving with surprising grace. Her eyes held depths that spoke of centuries rather than decades, and when she smiled, Lira felt an inexplicable sense of recognition. "Who are you?" Kael demanded, his sword half-drawn. "I am Morvenna, last keeper of the ancient ways, guardian of the bloodline secrets that your ancestors tried so hard to destroy." She looked directly at Lira, her gaze both knowing and kind. "I have been waiting for you for a very long time, child. You knew I would come here? I knew the bloodline would return to this place eventually. The power calls to its own, especially when the moon bleeds and the old magic stirs." Morvenna approached slowly, her attention fixed on the twins. "May I see them?" Lira hesitated, then stepped forward. As soon as the old woman came within reach of the children, both babies began to glow with a soft silver light that matched the radiance of the stones themselves. "Magnificent," Morvenna breathed. "Twins born under the blood moon, conceived in love, carried through sorrow and born into power. They are everything the prophecies promised." "What prophecies?" Kael asked, though his voice suggested he wasn't sure he wanted to know. "The coming of the moon-born twins, who would either unite the fractured lands in peace or tear them apart in war. Their power will be limited only by the wisdom of those who guide them and the strength of the bonds that shape them." Morvenna looked between Lira and Kael with obvious interest. "Tell me, young king, what do you see when you look at these children?" "I see innocents who deserve protection, regardless of what abilities they might possess. And when you look at their mother," Kael's jaw tightened slightly, "I see a woman of extraordinary courage and strength. But do you see a political asset to be managed, or a person whose happiness matters as much as your kingdom's needs?" A question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that went far beyond the immediate ceremony. Lira found herself holding her breath, waiting for an answer that might determine the direction of her entire future. "I see someone I love," Kael said quietly. "Someone whose welfare has become more important to me than political advantage." Morvenna nodded approvingly. "Then perhaps there is hope for what comes next." Before anyone could ask what she meant, the sound of approaching horses reached them across the moorland. Marcus, who had been watching the perimeter, called out a warning. "Multiple groups converging on our position. At least 50 riders from the north, maybe more from the east." "Aldwin's remaining forces," Kael said grimly. "They've come to claim the children." "Let them come," Morvenna said with surprising calm. "The ceremony has already begun, and it cannot be stopped now." As if responding to her words, the twins began to glow more brightly, their silver radiance spreading to encompass Lira as well. She felt power flowing through her like a river of starlight. connecting her to the ancient stones and to something vast and timeless that stretched back through generations of her bloodline. "What's happening to me?" she gasped, as the sensation intensified. "You are remembering what you were born to be," Morvenna replied. "The children cannot awaken to their full power alone. They need their mother's guidance and strength to channel what they will become." Around them, Kael's guards were taking defensive positions as the first enemy riders appeared on the horizon. But within the stone circle, a transformation was taking place that would reshape the balance of power, regardless of who won the coming battle. Lira felt her awareness expanding, connecting her not just to her children, but to every living thing. Within the circle, she could sense Kael's fierce determination, Marcus's unwavering loyalty, Master Aldrich's wonder and fear at witnessing ancient magic made real. Beyond the stones, she could feel the approaching enemies, their hearts full of greed and desperation. "The choice is before you now," Morvenna said urgently. "The twins' power will awaken with the moon's peak, but how it manifests depends on what you choose to do with it. You can use it to destroy your enemies, to compel obedience from all who oppose you, or you can use it to heal, to bring understanding where there is conflict, to unite rather than conquer. What if I choose wrong? There is no wrong choice, only consequences you must be willing to live with." The old woman's voice grew softer. "But remember, power used in love creates more love, while power used in fear creates only more fear." The first arrows began to fall around the stone circle as the enemy forces moved within range. Kael's guards responded with their own volleys, but they were outnumbered and would soon be overwhelmed. The twins began to cry, their voices harmonizing in a way that made the very air around them shimmer. "Lira!" Kael called, his sword already bloodied from the first clash with enemy scouts. "Whatever you're going to do it now!" She looked at her children, glowing with silver fire, then at the man who had risked everything to save them, who was now fighting to protect them from those who would use their power for conquest and control. The choice crystallized in her mind, with perfect clarity. Raising her voice to match her children's cries, Lira called out words in the old tongue that she had never learned but somehow knew. The power that had been building within the stone circle exploded outward like a wave of liquid moonlight, washing over the battlefield with irresistible force. But instead of destroying the enemy forces, the wave carried a different kind of magic. As it touched each person on the field, friend and enemy alike, it brought with it a moment of perfect clarity, a vision of what their choices had led to and what they might lead to in the future. Soldiers who had been fighting to capture children for political gain suddenly saw those children as they truly were. Innocent babies whose only crime was being born with unusual abilities. Raiders who had been motivated by promised rewards found themselves remembering their own families, their own children who would suffer if this conflict continued. Weapons began to lower as men on both sides of the battle stared at each other. With new understanding, the wave of Lira's power hadn't compelled them to stop fighting. It had simply shown them the truth of what they were doing and allowed them to choose differently. "Remarkable," Morvenna whispered. "In all the centuries I have guarded these secrets, I have never seen the power used with such wisdom." The immediate crisis was passing, but Lira could feel that the awakening of her children's abilities was not yet complete. The blood moon was reaching its peak, and with it would come the final transformation that would determine what kind of future they would all share. "There's more, isn't there?" she asked the old woman. "The children's individual powers must still manifest. What you have awakened is only the beginning." Morvenna looked at the approaching figures who had once been enemies, but were now walking forward with expressions of wonder rather than hostility. "And there is still the matter of what happens after tonight. Powers such as these do not go unnoticed by those who rule kingdoms." Kael appeared at Lira's side, his sword sheathed but his expression still wary. "What did you do to them?" "I showed them the truth, Lira replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. I gave them the choice to see clearly instead of through the fog of greed and fear. And now? She looked down at her children, who had stopped crying and were now watching the world around them with eyes that seemed far too wise for infants. Now we finish what we started, and then we figure out how to build a future where their gifts can be used for healing instead of conquest. As the blood moon reached its zenith and the final phase of the ceremony began, Lira found herself standing at the threshold of a new world, one where her children would grow up as the most powerful beings of their generation, where her own abilities would make her a force that kingdoms would court or fear, and where the love she shared with Kael would either flourish under the protection of their combined strength or wither under the weight of responsibilities too. Great for any ordinary relationship to bear. The choices made in the next few hours would echo through generations, and the woman who had once faced death for the crime of bearing twins now held the power to reshape the destiny of nations. But first, she had to ensure that power was awakened with wisdom rather than ambition, with love rather than fear, and with hope for a future where strength served protection rather than domination. The blood moon reached its zenith, casting everything in ethereal crimson light that made the ancient stones seem to pulse with their own heartbeat. Lira felt the power building within her children, a force so vast and pure it made her previous glimpses of their abilities seem like whispers compared to a storm. Little Darian began to glow with warm golden light that spread outward in gentle waves. Wherever his radiance touched the wounded soldiers who had gathered near the stone circle, their injuries healed completely. Not just the recent battle wounds, but old scars, chronic pains, ailments that had plagued them for years. Men who had limped for decades suddenly stood straight, their faces filled with wonder. Lyra's manifestation was different, but equally powerful. Silver light emanated from her tiny form, and as it touched the minds of those present, Lira could feel the barriers between hearts dissolving. Former enemies found themselves understanding each other's motivations, seeing past the propaganda and fear that had driven them to conflict. The raiders who had come to capture her children now knelt in the grass, tears streaming down their faces as they comprehended the magnitude of what they had nearly done. The crown of united clans, Morvenna said reverently, pointing to a shimmering apparition that was forming above the central stone. When the bloodline awakens fully, the ancient symbol of unity appears to mark the beginning of a new age. The crown was beautiful beyond description, woven from light and starfire, inscribed with symbols that seemed to shift between the languages of every kingdom and clan on the continent. As it solidified, becoming real rather than vision, Lira understood what was being offered to her. This is what Aldwin feared, she realized aloud. Not just powerful children, but the return of the moonborn leadership that could unite all the fractured territories under one rule. The choice is yours, Morvenna said gently. You can claim the crown and the authority it represents, bring peace to lands that have known only conflict for generations. Or you can allow it to fade, keep your children's powers hidden, and hope that others never discover what was awakened here tonight. Kael stepped closer, his expression intense. Lira, if you take that crown, you become more than just the mother of powerful children. You become a queen in your own right, with the authority to command loyalty from every bloodline that remembers the old ways. And if I don't, then we spend our lives running from those who will never stop trying to capture or kill your children to prevent this moment from coming again. The weight of the decision pressed down on her like a physical force. Around the stone circle, hundreds of people waited. Former enemies now united in their awe at what they were witnessing. Kael's loyal soldiers ready to follow whatever path the king chose. Refugees from the recent conflicts hoping for an end to the violence that had consumed their lives. But it was the sight of her children that ultimately made the choice clear. Darian and Lyra were no longer just babies. The awakening had accelerated their development, and they watched her with eyes that held intelligence and understanding, far beyond their physical age. They needed guidance, protection, and most importantly, they needed a world where their gifts would be welcomed rather than feared. "I accept," she said quietly, reaching toward the crown. The moment her fingers touched, the ethereal circlet power flooded through her with an intensity that staggered her. She felt her awareness expand to encompass not just the people present, but every soul within 100 miles who carried even a trace of the old bloodlines. She could sense their hopes, their fears, their desperate longing for leadership that valued compassion over conquest. But along with the power came responsibility beyond anything she had imagined. The welfare of entire kingdoms now rested on her decisions, and the choices she made would determine whether her children grew up in a world of peace or perpetual conflict. "The unity you offer," called out one of the former raiders, his voice carrying across the suddenly still air. "How do we know it won't become tyranny? How do we know you won't use this power to subjugate rather than liberate?" It was a fair question, and one that deserved an honest answer. Lira looked at the man, middle-aged, scarred by years of fighting, his eyes holding the wariness of someone who had seen too many promises broken by those in power. "You don't know," she admitted. "You have only my word and the evidence of how I choose to use these abilities. But I can tell you this: I have lived as one of the powerless, suffered at the hands of those who valued tradition over justice. I know what it feels like to watch your children face death because of fears that others refuse to question." She gestured to the healed soldiers, to the former enemies who now stood side by side without hostility. "The power my children and I possess works best when it serves love rather than fear, healing rather than harm. It grows stronger when used to unite rather than divide." "And what of kingdoms that refuse to accept your authority?" asked another voice. "What of rulers who see your emergence as a threat to their own power?" Before Lira could answer, Kael stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of 15 years of kingship. "Then they will face the unified strength of all who choose cooperation over conquest. I pledge my kingdom's support to this new alliance, not because I am compelled by magic, but because I have seen the wisdom and compassion of the woman who now wears the crown." His declaration sent ripples through the gathered crowd. A king, voluntarily, submitting to the authority of another was unprecedented, especially one who possessed no traditional claim to power beyond the abilities her children had awakened. "The blood moon wanes," Morvenna observed, her voice urgent. "The final choice must be made now. Will you claim full sovereignty over all the lands touched by the old bloodlines, or will you offer partnership to existing rulers who prove their commitment to justice?" Lira felt the pull of absolute power, the temptation to impose her will on a world that had shown her so much cruelty. It would be simple to use her children's abilities to compel obedience, to create peace through irresistible magical influence, rather than willing cooperation. But looking at Kael, seeing the trust in his eyes, despite the enormity of what she was considering, she knew that such power would corrupt everything she hoped to build. "Partnership," she said firmly. "Existing rulers who demonstrate their commitment to protecting the vulnerable and serving justice will be welcomed as equals in this alliance. Those who refuse will face the unified opposition of all who choose differently, but they will not be compelled by magic to submit." The crown above her head pulsed once with brilliant light, then settled into a steady, warm glow that spoke of power accepted with wisdom rather than grasped with ambition. As the blood moon began its descent toward the horizon, the immediate transformation was complete. But Lira could sense that what they had begun here would ripple outward for months and years to come. Word of this night would spread across every kingdom, reaching the ears of rulers who would have to decide whether to embrace the new order or fight against it. "What happens now?" she asked Morvenna. though she suspected the old woman's role as guide was coming to an end. Now you learn to live with the consequences of power used wisely, Morvenna replied with a smile that held both pride and sadness. My guardianship of the ancient secrets is complete. The bloodline has awakened, the crown has been claimed, and the future will be shaped by choices yet to come. Will you stay with us? Your knowledge, your experience, is yours now, passed through the crown, along with the authority it represents. The old woman was already becoming translucent, fading like mist in the morning sun. Trust your instincts, protect your children, and remember that the greatest power is knowing when not to use the strength you possess. As Morvenna disappeared completely, leaving only the scent of wildflowers and the echo of ancient wisdom, Lira turned to face the reality of what she had become. The crown of united clans rested lightly on her head, but its weight was measured in responsibilities rather than metal. "Your Majesty," said Marcus, approaching with the formal bow due to recognized royalty, "how do you wish us to proceed?" The title felt strange, but Lira recognized the necessity of accepting it. If she was going to lead, she needed to command. The respect that came with acknowledged authority. "We return to the capital," she said, her voice carrying new confidence, "but not as conquerors. We go as partners in building something better than what came before." Kael moved to stand beside her, and she saw in his expression a mixture of pride, love, and determination that made her heart soar. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would not face them alone. "Together?" he asked quietly, the single word carrying implications that went far beyond military alliance. "Together," she confirmed, and felt the crown pulse with warm approval as their hands intertwined. The journey back to the capital took on the character of a triumphal procession, though Lira had never intended it that way. Word of the events at the Standing Stones spread faster than their traveling party could move, carried by riders who had witnessed the awakening and felt compelled to share the news with every settlement they encountered. By the time they reached the first major town, crowds had gathered to see the woman who wore the crown of united clans and the children whose powers had ended a war without bloodshed. Lira found herself overwhelmed by the mixture of hope, fear, and desperate expectation in the faces that lined their route. "They want miracles," she confided to Kael during one of their evening camps. The twins were sleeping peacefully in their traveling cradle, showing no signs of the cosmic forces they had channeled just days before. "They expect me to solve every problem, heal every wound, right every injustice." "You can't save everyone," Kael replied gently. "But you can show them that their problems matter, that someone with power cares about their welfare." It was during their stop in the town of Millbrook that they encountered their first real test of the new order. The local lord, Baron Hastings, had initially welcomed them with appropriate ceremony, but his true feelings became clear during the private dinner he hosted in their honor. "Your Majesty," he said to Lira, his tone carefully respectful but with an underlying edge, "I confess some confusion about the nature of your authority. My family has ruled these lands for 3 generations under royal charter. Are we to understand that this arrangement is now void?" "Not at all," Lira replied, noting how every person at the table was listening intently to this exchange. "Your rule continues as long as it serves the welfare of your people. The crown of united clans doesn't seek to replace existing governance, but to ensure it operates with justice and compassion. And who determines whether our rule meets these standards? Your people do. The crown allows me to sense the true feelings of those under various forms of governance. If your subjects are content, if they feel protected and fairly treated, then your authority is secure." Baron Hastings' face had gone pale. "And if they are not content, then we work together to address their concerns. The goal is improvement, not punishment." That night, as they prepared to depart the following morning, a delegation of the Baron's subjects appeared at their camp. They were led by a middle-aged woman whose calloused hands and worn clothing marked her as one of the common folk, but who carried herself with the dignity of someone unafraid to speak truth to power. "Your Majesty," she said, curtsying awkwardly, "we heard what you told Lord Hastings about listening to the people's feelings. We wanted you to know. He's not a cruel man, but he's never lived as we do. The taxes are hard, the justice sometimes harsh, but we manage. And what would you change if you could?" The woman glanced back at her companions, drawing strength from their nods of encouragement. "The children in our village have no school. The Baron says education is wasted on farmers' offspring. And when someone can't pay their taxes, the punishment is severe. Sometimes families lose their homes for missing a single payment." Lira felt the crown's power, allowing her to sense the deeper truths behind these words. These people weren't seeking revolution or revenge. They wanted opportunity, fairness, and the chance to improve their children's lives. Their requests were reasonable, achievable, and exactly the kind of issues she had hoped to address. "I'll speak with Baron Hastings before we leave," she promised. "Changes may not come immediately, but they will come." The conversation with the Baron the next morning was illuminating. When presented with his subjects' concerns, his first reaction was defensive. "They've never complained before," he protested. "If they were unhappy, why didn't they speak to me directly?" "Because you've never created an environment where they felt safe to voice criticism," Lira replied gently. "The crown shows me their fears as well as their hopes. They worry that speaking up would bring punishment rather than improvement." To his credit, Baron Hastings genuinely seemed to consider this perspective. "What would you have me do?" "Establish a school. Reduce the penalties for late tax payments. Create regular opportunities for your people to bring concerns to your attention without fear of retaliation." Lira paused, then added, "And remember that ruling well means serving those under your authority, not simply commanding their obedience." The Baron agreed to the changes, and Lira could sense through the crown that his acceptance was genuine rather than merely diplomatic. It was a small victory, but one that demonstrated how the new order might work in practice, not through magical compulsion, but through accountability and the expectation of justice. Similar encounters marked their journey to the capital. In each settlement, Lira found herself mediating between rulers and subjects, using the crown's abilities to understand the true nature of various grievances and working to find solutions that served everyone's legitimate interests. "Your building is something unprecedented," Kael observed as they finally approached the familiar towers of the royal keep. "A system where power is accountable to compassion rather than tradition. I'm trying to build something that won't require constant intervention from someone wearing a magical crown," Lira corrected. "If this is going to work long-term, people need to learn to treat each other with fairness, because it's right, not because they're being watched by someone with supernatural abilities." Their arrival at the capital created a sensation that echoed through every level of society. The news of Lira's transformation had preceded them, but seeing the crown of united clans in person, witnessing the obvious changes in the twins, and observing the way former enemies now traveled together in apparent harmony made the reality undeniable. The royal council was waiting in the great hall, their expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed alarm. Lira entered flanked by Kael and carrying her children, the crown visible but not ostentatious, her bearing confident but not arrogant. "Your Majesties," said Lord Chancellor Aldred, using the plural form with obvious reluctance, "the council wishes to understand the implications of recent events for the governance of this kingdom." "The governance continues as before," Kael replied firmly, "with the addition of oversight to ensure that our policies serve justice as well as stability." "Oversight from whom?" "From the Crown of United Clans," Lira said, stepping forward, "which represents not foreign conquest, but a return to the principles that originally justified royal authority: protection of the innocent, fair treatment of all subjects, and the use of power to serve rather than to dominate. And if the council disagrees with this arrangement, Lira felt the crown, allowing her to sense the true feelings of each council member. Most were genuinely concerned about maintaining stability and protecting the kingdom's interests. A few harbored ambitions that put their personal power above the welfare of the people they served, but none were actively malicious or irredeemably corrupt. Then we discuss your concerns and work together to find solutions that serve everyone's legitimate needs, she replied. The Crown doesn't seek to eliminate existing institutions, but to ensure they operate with wisdom and compassion. The formal session continued for hours, establishing the practical details of how the new arrangement would function. But the real test came that evening, when Lira and Kael finally had a private moment to address the personal implications of everything that had changed. "The marriage proposals," Kael said, as they sat together in the garden behind the keep, watching their children play with toys that seemed to spark with inner light at their touch. "The political alliances the council was so eager to arrange, they're no longer necessary, are they?" "No," Lira agreed. "The Crown of United Clans provides all the political authority and alliance-building capacity your kingdom needs. So the question becomes, what do we want for ourselves? Not as rulers, not as political partners, but as people who found something precious together?" Lira looked at him, seeing past the crown he wore to the man who had risked everything to save her life, who had stood beside her through every challenge and transformation. "I want what I've wanted since that first evening by the fire in your quarters, a partnership built on love rather than obligation, understanding rather than political necessity. Even though that partnership now involves ruling multiple kingdoms and raising children with legendary powers, especially because of that." She reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers as they had during that first moment of mutual recognition. "If we're going to reshape the world, I can't think of anyone I'd rather do it with." As the sun set over the capital of what was rapidly becoming the center of a new kind of civilization, Lira reflected on the journey that had brought her from a widow facing death in a village square to a queen whose decisions would shape the future of generations. The transformation was complete, but in many ways, the real work was just beginning. 5 years had passed since the night at the Standing Stones, and the world had transformed in ways that even Lira's enhanced vision could not have fully anticipated. The Crown of United Clans had fulfilled its promise of bringing peace to lands that had known only conflict, but more importantly, it had inspired a fundamental shift in how people understood the relationship between power and responsibility. Standing in the Great Hall of the Keep, now expanded to accommodate representatives from dozens of allied territories, Lira watched her children demonstrate the skills they had been learning under the guidance of masters recruited from across the known world. At 5 years old, Darian could heal injuries that would have meant certain death just a generation earlier, while Lira could help resolve conflicts by allowing disputants to truly understand each other's perspectives. "The delegation from the Eastern Kingdoms has arrived," announced Marcus, now elevated to the position of Chancellor of Diplomatic Relations. "They're requesting an audience to discuss joining the alliance." The Eastern Kingdoms had been among the last holdouts, their rulers initially dismissing reports of the Moonborn awakening as propaganda designed to justify territorial expansion. But as refugee flows and trade relationships demonstrated the genuine improvements in quality of life within the Allied territories, even the most skeptical monarchs had begun reconsidering their positions. "Send them to the council chamber," Lira replied, "and ask Master Aldrich to bring the children. It's important for them to observe these negotiations." The formal diplomatic session that followed illustrated how thoroughly the nature of international relations had evolved. Rather than the traditional exchange of threats and bribes that had characterized negotiations in the past, the discussions focused on practical questions about implementing the alliance's core principles. protection for the vulnerable, accountability for those in power, and the establishment of institutions that serve justice rather than mere stability. "Your Majesty," said Queen Valeriana of Eastmarch, a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s who had ruled her kingdom with ruthless efficiency for decades, "my advisors tell me that territories joining your alliance have seen significant improvements in agricultural productivity, reduced crime rates, and increased trade revenues. How do you account for these changes?" "When people feel secure and fairly treated, they invest more energy in building rather than protecting what they have," Lira explained. "When disputes are resolved through understanding rather than force, resources that would have been spent on conflict can be directed toward improvement." "And the role of the moonborn abilities in achieving these results?" Lira glanced at her children, who were listening intently despite their young age. "My children's gifts help people understand each other more clearly and heal more quickly from the wounds that conflict creates. But the real changes come from human choices, the decision to treat others with compassion, to use power responsibly, to value cooperation over domination." "Still," Queen Valeriana pressed, "your abilities give you significant advantages in maintaining order. What guarantees do we have that this power won't eventually be used to suppress legitimate disagreement or criticism?" It was a question that had been raised many times over the past 5 years, and one that Lira had grappled with personally. The crown of united clans provided her with capabilities that could indeed be used to compel obedience or silence opposition. The temptation to solve problems through magical intervention rather than patient negotiation was constant. "You have my word, and the evidence of 5 years of governance that has strengthened rather than restricted the rights of our subjects," she replied. "But more importantly, you have the safeguard of publicity. Every major decision I make is witnessed by representatives from allied territories. The Crown's power works best in the light of scrutiny and accountability." The negotiations continued for 3 days, but by the end, Queen Valeriana had committed to joining the alliance, bringing with her not just her own kingdom but influence that would likely persuade several neighboring territories to follow suit. That evening, as Lira and Kael walked through the expanded city that surrounded the keep, they could see the physical manifestations of the changes they had helped to create. Schools that served children regardless of their family's status. Healing centers where the sick received treatment based on need rather than ability to pay. Markets where traders from dozens of different cultures conducted business under fair and consistent rules. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had made different choices?" Kael asked as they paused beside a fountain that had been built to commemorate the 5th anniversary of the Alliance. "If you had chosen to use the Crown's power for conquest instead of cooperation every day," Lira admitted. "The capacity for abuse is always there. Sometimes I think that's the Crown's most important gift, not the power itself, but the constant awareness of how easily it could be misused." They were interrupted by the approach of a young messenger, one of the students, from the diplomatic academy that had been established to train the next generation of alliance administrators. "Your Majesties," the boy said with a bow that managed to be respectful without being servile, "there's been a message from the northern frontier. A village there is requesting assistance with a situation involving children born with unusual abilities." Lira and Kael exchanged glances. Over the years, they had encountered dozens of such situations, children born with various manifestations of the old bloodlines, parents struggling to understand abilities that had been hidden for generations, communities torn between fear and wonder at the emergence of powers they had believed were extinct. "Prepare a traveling party," Kael instructed the messenger. "Small group, emphasis on healers and teachers rather than soldiers." "We'll leave tomorrow," Lira added. "And send word ahead that we're coming as helpers, not conquerors." As the messenger departed to carry out these instructions, Lira reflected on how these missions had become some of the most important work of her reign. Each child born with awakened abilities represented both a precious gift and a potential source of conflict, depending on how their emergence was handled. "The children are asking when they can start accompanying us on these missions," Kael mentioned as they resumed their walk. "Soon," Lira replied, watching a group of young people from various allied territories studying together in the garden of the diplomatic academy. But not until they're old enough to understand the full weight of what their presence means to people who are dealing with these situations. "Do you think they'll choose to follow the path we've laid out for them?" It was a question that kept Lira awake some nights. Darian and Lyra were growing into their abilities with wisdom and compassion, but they were also developing their own personalities, their own ideas about how their gifts should be used. The day would come when they would have to decide for themselves what kind of leaders they wanted to be. "I hope they'll choose to serve rather than to rule," she said finally. "But ultimately, that will be their decision to make." The next morning's departure for the northern frontier felt familiar and yet different from those early journeys when everything about their situation had been uncertain. Now they traveled as established leaders of a proven alliance, welcomed rather than feared, sought out rather than fleeing from danger. But the core purpose remained the same: to help people navigate the challenges of a world where ancient powers were awakening, where traditional structures were giving way to new possibilities, and where the choices made by individuals could echo across generations. As their party rode north toward another village where children with unusual gifts needed guidance and protection, Lira felt the same sense of purpose that had sustained her through every trial since that first night in Varrow's village square. The crown she wore represented power beyond anything the world had seen for centuries, but it was the responsibility that came with that power, the obligation to use it wisely and compassionately, that gave her life its deepest meaning. Behind them, the capital continued its daily routine, a city where former enemies worked side by side, where ancient prejudices were giving way to new understandings, and where the future was being built one careful choice at a time. Ahead lay another opportunity to extend those possibilities to people who needed hope, guidance, and the assurance that extraordinary gifts could be sources of blessing rather than curse. The story that had begun with a widow facing death for bearing twins had become an epic of transformation that touched every corner of the known world. But at its heart, it remained what it had always been, a testament to the power of love over fear, understanding over prejudice, and the hope that even in the darkest circumstances, the choice to do right could change everything. As the sun climbed higher and their destination drew closer, Lira Ashwood, once a powerless refugee, now the crown-bearer of united clans, rode forward into a future that held infinite possibilities. For those brave enough to choose compassion over conquest, wisdom over power, and love over everything that would divide them from one another. The twins rode beside their parents, their young faces bright with anticipation for the work ahead, carrying within themselves the seeds of abilities that could reshape the world. But more importantly, they carried the values that had shaped their upbringing, the understanding that true strength lay in lifting others up, that real power came from service rather than domination, and that the greatest magic of all was the capacity to see the humanity in everyone they encountered. The story of the Alpha King, who defied ancient law to save an Omega widow, had become the foundation legend of a new age. But for those who lived it, it remained beautifully simply the story of two people who had found love strong enough to change the world, and children whose gifts would ensure that change endured for generations to come.